History of the Hungarian People's Republic. World War II caused massive destruction in Hungary, mostly because the German fascist army stole everything they could and took it to Germany, and what little they couldn't steal, they blew up, burned and destroyed. War devastation. Quote, "The siege of Budapest lasted 51 days before the Russians captured the city. Hardly a house was intact, and thousands of soldiers and civilians had been killed." Unquote. Quote, "The Germans, departing, had taken 214,000 tons of goods, including machinery and food, by barge or railway, 32,000 wagons, or lorry, 8,000 loads. 70,000 dwellings had been destroyed, and a quarter of the inhabitants were homeless. A gold train had taken away the valuables stolen, mainly from Jewish families. The property stolen from Jewish families and others, and the gold reserve of the National Bank, ended up in mining shafts in Austria. The Holy Crown of King Saint Stephen I and the crown jewels were also transported west. Half of the industrial plant, the railways, the bridges, the livestock had gone." Unquote. Quote, "Budapest was a city of rubble, burned tanks and rotting corpses. Every bridge over the Danube destroyed by the Nazis. Of 35,500 apartment houses, 29,987 had been destroyed or badly damaged. Bands of starving children roamed in the streets, wailing for bread and their parents. Of the city's fine bus service, 16 buses were left. The Germans had driven off in the rest. Gas, water supply, and electricity services were disrupted. All telegraph and telephone poles had been cut down by the Germans. Railway lines had been cut through at regular intervals by special sabotage machines. Every road leading into Budapest had been mined, every bridge over 30 feet long destroyed. 1,200 locomotives and over 40,000 railway wagons were driven off to Germany. There was no food in the country. Livestock had been reduced from 8.6 million to 3.2 million. Budapest in early 1945 was a hopeless city of rubble, stench and starvation. Most of the agricultural machinery, tractors and combines had been destroyed or shipped back to Germany. 80% of the draft cattle had been killed." Unquote. Quote, "The German invaders and the Arrow Cross agencies endeavored to take away everything they could lay their hands on, wherever this was not prevented by the resistance of the Hungarian people or the advance of the Soviet troops. 3/4 of the pool of railway trucks, 2/3 of the operable locomotives, and most of the motor vehicles. The value of the goods taken to the west amounted to about $2,000 million. The retreating fascists had made 40% of the rail network unusable and demolished thousands of railway and load bridges." Unquote. I've cited a lot of numbers here, but the level of sheer destruction is almost impossible to comprehend. More than 500,000 Hungarian Jews had been killed in the Holocaust, and hundreds of thousands of others had lost their lives at the hands of the fascists. 2/3 of trains, almost all cars and buses, and the vast majority of livestock had been destroyed in Hungary, while practically all homes in Budapest had been destroyed. Electricity and rail networks had been clipped into little pieces by sabotage machines. All major roads had been mined, and practically every bridge had been blown up. Half of industry had been stolen or destroyed, while 90% of the remaining industry had been damaged, and all the National Bank's gold reserves had been stolen. The fascists had left the country destroyed and starving. Despite their own problems, the USSR was able to send food aid to Hungary. For example, quote, "At the end of March, the Soviet Union sent 1,500 wagons of cereals, 300 wagons of meat, and 200 wagons of sugar to Hungary as loan." Unquote. Quote, "The Red Army tried to preserve Budapest, and especially its citizens, as much as possible. Heavy artillery and bomber planes didn't bomb the city." Unquote. Quote, "After liberation, the Red Army was first to deliver food supplies and medical aid to Hungarians, saving the citizens of Budapest from starvation and epidemic." Unquote. Liberation. End of the war. Debrecen Provisional Government. While the fighting was still going on, a provisional anti-fascist government was set up in Debrecen. This anti-fascist government was a coalition of the Communist Party, Social Democratic Party, the National Peasant Party, the Smallholder Party, as well as trade unions and other democratic forces. National committees of trade unionists, communists, partisan fighters, and others also spontaneously emerged in liberated areas. These united to the Debrecen government and became the foundation of a new democratic state. Quote, "Tanks and field guns stood blackened where they had been hit, and the bodies of soldiers lay unburied in the winter, but politics were beginning. In villages, towns, districts, and counties occupied by the Russians, national committees sprang up, run by representatives of left-wing movements or trade unions. A national council on these lines was installed in Debrecen on 21st December 1944. Unquote. Quote, 230 delegates assembled, a third of them communists, from villages and townships liberated by the Red Army, and they elected a new government from all the anti-fascist parties. Its program included land reform and confiscation for war criminals." Unquote. Quote, "For the first time after 25 years underground, the Communist Party began to freely operate, and it was the first to begin the work of reconstruction and the creation of a new power. The great cause of national reconstruction and joining in the war against the Nazis required the creation of a new central power, a Hungarian state. A clear-cut program had to be drawn up to rally the national forces and rebuild the country. The Communist Party issued such a program for a democratic national rebirth, published on 30th November 1944 in the Debrecen newspaper Neplap. This document stated, quote, "Our country is experiencing the most disastrous catastrophe in its history. The leaders of Hungary, hiring themselves out to the Germans, plunged Hungary into the Hitlerite imperialist war. They aligned themselves with the German fascists, because with such help they intended to subjugate the neighboring peoples and ruthlessly suppress the Hungarian people within the country and keep them in slavery. The country is suffering under the fatal consequences of this criminal policy. Despite this, the Communist Party proclaims that there will be a Hungarian rebirth." Unquote. Quote, "In April, the Provisional Government moved to Budapest. The Communist Party line for the moment was that Hungary was experiencing a bourgeois democratic revolution and that all democratic elements should therefore cooperate. Unite all forces for reconstruction was the slogan coined by Mátyás Rákosi, first secretary of the Hungarian Communist Party. As a proof of goodwill, communists helped to rebuild churches. They also activated the other political parties permitted by the Allied Control Commission." Unquote. Zinner also points out, quote, "the apparent concern of the communists with national welfare and the zeal with which they led the reconstruction of war-damaged installations, including churches." Unquote. Quote, "The Provisional Government undertook to conclude an armistice with the Allies, to pay the reparations, to wage war against Germany, to repeal anti-Semitic and anti-democratic laws, to guarantee democratic rights and to institute universal and secret suffrage, to disband right-wing political movements and punish war criminals, and to effect a land reform." Unquote. Quote, "The leader of the Hungarian Communist Party, Mátyás Rákosi, stepped onto the tribune. He was welcomed with immense enthusiasm. "Long live Rákosi, long live Rákosi," resounded from the crowd. "Freedom," Comrade Rákosi began his speech, and hundreds of thousands roared back from every corner of the square. "Freedom." Unquote. By April 4th, the whole territory of Hungary had been liberated from the Nazis. Quote, "Hungary received aid from the Soviet Union for restoring economic life and production, for example to replace the horses stolen by the Germans. New horses and cars were brought for transporting food supplies. The Soviet Union aided the development of the Hungarian national economy and living standard of the citizens by reducing war reparations by 50%. Unquote. Land reform. The most important political action of the provisional government was land reform. It was undeniable that the Hungarian peasants had suffered horribly under the rule of the Habsburg monarchy and then under Horthy. Quote, "In Hungary, peasants were more than the rest oppressed and exploited." Unquote. Quote, "The greatest problem of modern Hungary, the vast inequality of landholding. It was a largely peasant country, and the peasants often farmed with primitive methods." Unquote. Quote, "Smallholders only amounted to about 1/3 of the rural population. The rest were either totally landless or dwarf holders, compelled, that is, to sell their labor on a market where manpower was cheaper than anything else." Unquote. Quote, "Before the war, some 400,000 Hungarians possessed so little land that they had to sell their labor power as agrarian serfs in order to keep from starvation, and another 400,000 had no land at all." Unquote. Historian Elizabeth Wiskman wrote, quote, "In Hungary, the distribution of land remained the most unjust in Central Europe." Unquote. Quote, "Among East European countries, Hungary was the worst instance of the system of giant landed estates and their complement, a vast agricultural proletariat living below subsistence level. This state of affairs was preserved unimpaired up to 1945. Unquote. Before World War II, quote, "It was calculated that in Hungary 24% of the rural population belonged to the category of unemployed or underemployed." Unquote. Quote, "In March, the Debrecen government carried through a land reform. This was long overdue in a country where almost half the arable land had belonged to 1% of the landowners. 4.5 million acres were now distributed among 660,000 peasants. Tremendous posters everywhere claimed this reform as an achievement of the Communist Party." Unquote. Quote, "Committees dominated by communists and the National Peasants' Party people carried out the redistribution, and within 3 months, 8 million acres had been taken over, some for state farms, but the greater part, 5 million acres, given to 500,000 new owners. The Catholic Church lost 90% of its lands." Unquote. Quote, "The second largest landowners in Hungary, the Esterházys, between them owned 750,000 acres, of which the senior member of the family, Prince Paul Esterházy, owned 300,000. They owned 15 castles in Hungary, several more in Austria and Bavaria. There was only one larger landowner in Hungary, and that was the Roman Catholic Church." Unquote. The peasants had lived in misery, while the richest 1% owned half the land in the whole country. The land had primarily belonged to the clergy and the nobility, who now lost most of the power they had held century after century. They had literally lived like kings, standing over the peasants. The land reform was necessary to destroy the feudal social relations, to free the peasants from the total power of the church and the noble families." Although land reform was only the first step, it immediately produced favorable results. Economist Warriner writes, quote, "The land reform has brought a complete social and economic transformation in the country. In 1947, I visited again the same villages that I had known in 1936, where land had now been distributed. The most noticeable change then was better food. The new peasants were eating wheat and rye bread regularly instead of maize, and drinking coffee with sugar, unknown before. Peasants, who had been estate laborers before, and had now become owners of the standard 12-acre holding, said that in a bad year their real income was twice what it had been before, and with a good harvest would be 3 or 4 times as high. Their money income was large enough to buy boots for the whole family. 2 years later, in 1949, the dominant impression in the villages was the good supply of consumer goods. People's shops had been started with a wide range of textiles, shoes, aluminum saucepans, china." Unquote. Journalist Wilfred G. Burchett interviewed one of the noble families after the land reform. The nobility had lost their massive landholdings and their numerous castles, mansions, and private parks. Quote, "Countess Esterhazy shuddered when I asked what had happened to the properties at Tada. 'It's too dreadful to speak about,' she said. 'The castle has been turned into a lunatic asylum. The beautiful old hunting lodge has become a communist youth hostel. The English park was turned into a training ground for the Olympic team, because they said the atmosphere and climate was like that of England and would help the team that was going to England for the Olympic Games. The parks are all thrown open, anyone can wander through them,' and her china blue eyes filled with tears. I made a tour of some of the Esterhazy castles to see for myself what was going on. Tada is a beautiful village, about 10 miles off the main road between Budapest and Vienna. Sure enough, the main castle has become a hospital for the insane. The hunting lodge was full of happy young people, including a group of Canadians who had been working on one of the volunteer youth brigade projects. It was Sunday in midsummer. The 2 magnificent parks were crowded with villagers and peasants, reclining in the shade of massive oak and elm trees. More peasants and some workers from the nearby Tada coal mines, Esterhazy property before they were nationalized, were splashing away in a fine swimming pool that had formerly been a private preserve of the Esterhazys. Lives of the Tada peasants are still hard. They still work from dawn to dark, and have little enough at the end of the month to buy clothes or other necessities with. They are still plagued by priests, who tell them it's sinful to have taken the land of their masters, and that God and the Americans will punish them for it. "My boy's at the university," said one brown old peasant, squatting on the ground in the English park at Tada. "He's learning to be an engineer. Do you think I could ever have managed that in the old days? If I'd saved up everything and could sell a pig or 2, I couldn't even keep him at school after he was 12. Now they even pay him for learning. He's at one of the people's colleges, and they pay him enough that he sends me and the missus a bit on the side." Unquote. Of the land reform he said, quote, "We could have done with a bit more land. It's hard to make do without 10 acres, but we live all right. We eat better than we ever did." Unquote. Quote, "At the village of Esterhazy, the castle had been turned over to an agricultural college. On the Sunday I visited it, there was a big Mother's Day meeting in progress. In the castle courtyard, seats had been set out in the warm autumn sunshine, and parents were watching a performance by the school children. On other Esterhazy estates, parks had been thrown open to the public, in some cases used as plant research stations, castles used as hospitals, schools, orphanages, youth hostels. Unquote. When Rákosi had been sentenced to prison for life by the fascists, he had said, in front of the Horthyist court in 1926, quote, "Land will only be distributed in Hungary by the communists." Unquote. Now this promise became reality. Quote, "Blessed should be the name of he who has granted us land," a delegation of farmers from Szolnok County told Rákosi in early March. Unquote. Factory committees. It was essential to begin normal production as soon as possible to produce necessary goods, electricity, and to repair war damage. Factories destroyed by the war and looted by the Nazis had to be restored. Workers organized into factory committees took over the management and control of factories. Quote, "The management of industrial plants was taken over by the factory committees as they were known. For the time being, these did not change the legal status of the plant. This remained in private ownership. Since, however, in most cases the owners and the company management had fled the country, the factory committees assumed responsibility for the most important tasks linked with the starting of production." Unquote. Quote, "With the setting up of factory committees under communist leadership, workers' control was realized in practice. Communists and Social Democrats jointly pushed through a government decree which was passed in February 1945 for the recognition of the activities and jurisdiction of the factory committees. The factory committees were officially authorized to take control of production as well as the trade activities of the industrial companies and could play an active role in the regulation of labor relations and the administration of companies. Control by the workers in factories and mines was established as soon as they started to operate, but pressure had to be exerted on the right wing to give government approval to this practice. The right wing considered this a forced concession. At the same time, they emphasized the capitalist ownership of the factories, in order to be able to limit later the jurisdiction of the factory committees to the settlement of labor disputes. However, the factory committees were power positions of the working class, which strengthened the government's influence among the workers and at the same time reduced capitalist exploitation." Unquote. The masses had already dealt two serious blows to the landowners and the capitalists. The land had been redistributed to the peasants, and workers established themselves in factory committees, which already had an important role in managing factories, even though they were still privately owned, and they were a position from where the workers could defend their interests against the capitalists. Capitalists no longer had total control over the factories, and if Hungary was to build socialism, transferring factories to socialist ownership could happen smoothly since they were already worker-controlled. The workers were already learning to manage the factories themselves without the capitalists. 1945 elections. Quote, "In November 1945, the first completely free election under secret ballot ever held in the history of Hungary took place." Unquote. There actually were elections with universal secret ballot already during the 1919 Hungarian communist government, but excluding that, Gunther is correct. The four largest parties received the following results. Quote, "Smallholders received 57%, Communists and Social Democrats 17% each, National Peasants 6%. The coalition government, or People's Front, continued in office." Unquote. It was significant that despite decades of intense anti-communist propaganda and a prevailing environment of reactionary, nationalist and religious ideology, the Communist Party emerged as one of the largest parties. In fact, the Communists had the same amount of votes as the Social Democrats, despite the fact that the Communists had never been able to organize legally before and had been heavily persecuted. Of course, the Communists had some supporters from their underground years. They also received new support because they were the main organizers of the anti-fascist resistance movement and partisan movement. The communists were also the main organizers of the land reform. They had quickly emerged as the leading force in the factory committees and as an equal partner with the Social Democrats in the trade unions. The communists were used to underground conditions, and thus their organization was not paralyzed by the Nazi occupation and arrow-cross coup d'etat to the same extent as the other parties. Quote, "Despite the persistence of popular stereotypes concerning the communists, the first few months of 1945 witnessed a remarkable increase in the Hungarian Communist Party's popularity. Membership skyrocketed. The organization had only a few thousand members in January, but by October, party membership had reached 500,000. Unquote. Quote, "The party's newspaper, Sabat Nep, whose chief editor was Comrade Revai, soon increased from 100,000 to 300,000 copies." Unquote. Some right-wing anti-communists might want to claim that communists simply rigged the elections or used some kind of election fraud, but this was not the case. Even anti-communist historians like Paul E. Zinner were forced to admit that, quote, "The election was free. It met the highest standards of democracy. It was secret, universal and direct, and everyone could vote according to his conscience. On the basis of the conduct of the election and the reaction of the communists to its outcome, no one could describe their behavior as anything but impeccable. They obviously did not tamper with the ballot." Unquote. According to Zinner, there were, quote, "liberties seldom if ever experienced before, free election by democratic franchise, free press, free speech, an intensive, formal parliamentary life." Unquote. The anti-communist historian Kertész also says that, quote, "In Hungary, free elections took place." Unquote. The big winner of the election was the Smallholders Party, a rather amorphous centrist party without any clear ideology or message. It was logical that the smallholders could receive a lot of votes, but their popularity was of temporary character. The smallholders appealed to everyone, and at the same time didn't fully satisfy anybody. In a country where the vast majority of the population had never been able to vote before, the smallholders seemed like a safe bet. It would have been unrealistic for them to suddenly jump to the Communist Party or Social Democratic Party. Likewise, the National Peasant Party was distinctly left-wing and thus couldn't appeal to everyone, and also focused primarily on the peasants, and thus didn't appeal to the urban population. New currency. The devastation of the war, massive theft of Hungarian property and gold by the Nazis, the terrible shortage of goods and black marketeering had caused massive inflation. Quote, "In 1945 and 1946, Hungary was in the grip of the greatest inflation in history. People rushed out with their whole week's salaries to buy a few bus tickets or a loaf of bread." Unquote. In order to make the situation tolerable, workers at factories often received their wages in food and other products directly, and other goods were rationed. Quote, "Most experts were of the view that a stable currency could not be established without a foreign loan." Unquote. The inflation was so bad that the communists suggested a completely new currency. Quote, "On the initiative of the communists, a currency reform was worked out and put into effect on August 1st, 1946. One new forint was valued at 426, followed by 27 zeros of the old pengos. Overnight, Hungary had a stable currency which could buy real goods, which now began to appear in the shops. Currency reform won the communists great prestige." Unquote. Hungary's gold had been stolen and production had been decimated. There was a shortage of everything, and black market prices skyrocketed. But as soon as production got going again, it was possible to solve the inflation, since prices now remained stable and the currency was actually worth something, consumers could actually get what they wanted with the new currency. After the currency was stabilized, right-wing anti-communist so-called historians changed their narrative. Nowadays, they describe the ending of the worst inflation in world history as nothing special. They do not want to give communists credit for this achievement, and instead suggest that the inflation really could have been easily ended and blame the communists for ending it too slowly. For example, in his book Revolution in Hungary, Zinner says, quote, "Once inflation was in progress, the communists refrained from halting it," unquote. And, quote, "Hungary's currency could have been stabilized long before August 1st, 1946, unquote. Even putting an end to the worst inflation in history is not good enough for anti-communists. They don't give communists any credit for it. I would like to ask Mr. Zinner, if ending the inflation was supposedly so easy, then why did the capitalist opposition parties, or the smallholders party, not do it, and instead claimed that it could only be solved with massive loans from the West? The communists had emerged as one of the biggest parties in Hungary, and clearly as the most active political force in the country. They had a plan for the reconstruction of the nation and solving the most important economic and social problems. They had led the creation of the anti-fascist democratic coalition government. They organized workers into factory committees, which began to restore production. The Communist Party grew into a mass party of hundreds of thousands of members. The Communists also carried out land reform, together with the National Peasant Party, and stabilized the country's currency, quickly ending the worst inflation in human history. As a result of these and many other successful policies, the popularity of the communists would continue to grow rapidly, while the popularity of the right-wing and reformist forces would begin to diminish.